My husband had the divorce papers served to me on a Wednesday morning at our kitchen table by a process server who knocked twice and left before I had finished reading the first page. 11 years of marriage delivered in a manila envelope while my coffee went cold beside it. What the papers listed under marital assets was so far from the truth that I read the financial disclosure 3 times before I understood it was not a mistake, it was a strategy. He had listed the business we built together, the one I had worked inside of for 9 of the 11 years we were married, as his sole proprietorship, established before the marriage, developed independently, valued at a fraction of what I had watched it become. Stay with me, because 6 months before those papers arrived at my kitchen table, I had already handed a forensic accountant every piece of financial documentation I could access, and by that Wednesday morning, her report was 214 pages long. My name is Serena Voss. I was 41 the morning my husband decided 11 years of shared work could be rewritten into his origin story alone. He had been planning it for longer than the filing. I had simply started counting earlier than he expected. It did not begin with the papers. It began on a Tuesday evening 14 months before that, when I was reviewing our household account for a routine transfer and noticed a recurring withdrawal I did not recognize. Not large, $80 every third week to a vendor name I had never seen on any receipt. It would have been easy to overlook. I had overlooked it twice already. The third time, something in me stopped instead of scrolling past. I did not ask my husband about it that night. I wrote it down instead, in a small notebook I kept in my bag, the kind of notebook you use for grocery lists and parking reminders, because that is exactly what it needed to look like if anyone ever saw it. I wrote the date, the amount, the vendor name, and a question mark. Then I kept watching. Over the next 6 weeks, I found 3 more things I could not explain. A credit inquiry on a bureau I had not authorized, a utilities bill forwarded to an address I did not recognize, a business registration document in a search result that came up when I was looking for something else entirely, a company name I had never heard of, registered 8 months earlier, with my husband listed as the sole director. I want to be honest about what I felt when I found that document. It was not anger, not yet. It was the very specific feeling of a pattern becoming visible, the moment when small, separate things stop looking like coincidences and start looking like a plan. I had been inside our finances long enough to know what things were supposed to look like. I had also been inside our marriage long enough to know what it meant when my husband became careful about his phone. I found the forensic accountant through a referral from a family law attorney I consulted privately, without telling my husband, on a Friday afternoon when I told him I was having lunch with a colleague. Her name was Patricia Wren. She had 22 years of experience in financial investigations and the specific manner of someone who has sat across from too many people who thought their paperwork was airtight. She looked at what I had collected in my notebook and on my phone and asked me one question before she agreed to take the case. "How long do you need this to stay quiet?" "Until I understand the full picture," I said. She nodded. "Then let's build the picture." Over the next 5 months, Patricia and her team worked through everything I could legally access: joint account records, business filings, property registrations, corporate disclosures, vendor payment trails. She did not speculate, she documented. Every finding had a source, a date, a corresponding record. The report grew in sections, each one a different layer of what my husband had been constructing quietly for the better part of 2 years. 3 shell companies, registered across 2 states under names that meant nothing on their own, but formed a clear structure when mapped together. 18 months of asset transfers, moving equity from the business we built together into accounts that existed entirely outside our marital financial picture. a property purchased 11 months before he filed, titled under one of the shell companies, never mentioned, never disclosed, valued at $400,000. The total value of what Patricia documented across all accounts, all companies, all properties, all transferred equity was $2.3 million. The filing he served me had declared total marital assets of $140,000. Beat. I read that number in Patricia's report on a Monday evening. I closed the document, I finished my tea, and I called the family law attorney the next morning to let her know we were ready to proceed. The mediation session was scheduled for a Thursday, 6 weeks after the filing. My husband arrived with his attorney, a man who specialized in high-asset divorce cases, and who, I later learned, had advised my husband that his documentation was clean enough to withstand review. He had not accounted for Patricia. Neither had his attorney. My attorney placed Patricia's report on the table at 9:14 in the morning. It was bound, tabbed, and indexed, 214 pages with a summary cover sheet that listed in 3 columns the asset category, the documented value, and the source reference for each finding. My husband looked at it the way people look at something they recognize but cannot immediately explain seeing in a place it was never supposed to appear. Beat. His attorney asked for a recess before my attorney had finished introducing the document. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When they came back, my husband would not look at me directly. His attorney looked at mine with an expression I had not seen him when we sat down. Something careful, something recalibrated. Hold. Voice low, careful. Stay with me. Because what happened after that recess was not the end of the morning. It was the moment my husband's attorney made a mistake that cost his client more than the report already had. The mistake his attorney made was a question he looked at Patricia's report, at the shell company section specifically, and asked my attorney how the information had been obtained. It was meant to suggest improper access. It was meant to introduce doubt about the documentation's admissibility. My attorney let the question sit for a moment before she answered. Every document in that report was obtained through legally available public filings, authorized account access by a named account holder, and standard financial investigation methodology. We are happy to provide sourcing for any individual item. She paused. Would you like to start with the property in Sycamore Ridge or the third shell company's vendor payment history? His attorney did not ask a follow-up question. My husband looked at the table. The mediation session did not resolve that Thursday. It was adjourned and rescheduled, which is what happens when one party arrives expecting to negotiate a settlement based on declared assets and discovers the other party has documentation that makes the declared assets look like a rough draft. His attorney needed time. My husband needed time. I had already had 6 months. He called me that evening from a number I did not recognize, which told me he had anticipated I might not answer his own. I answered anyway because I wanted to hear what version of the conversation he had prepared. "Serena?" he said. His voice had a quality I had not heard before. Not exactly apologetic, not exactly afraid, something in between that had not yet decided which direction to move. I need you to understand that I was protecting the business. I built that company. We built it, I said. I was there for 9 of the 11 years. I have the email records. Silence. Patricia is very thorough, I added. Pause. He did not respond to that. After a moment, he said something I had not expected. I didn't think you were paying attention. I know, I said. That was the part you got wrong. Long pause. He ended the call. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen for a while after, in the chair where the process server had found me on that Wednesday morning, and felt something settle that had been loose for a very long time. Not satisfaction, exactly, more like the specific relief of a calculation that has finally come out even. 3 days before the rescheduled mediation, my husband's attorney filed a motion to exclude Patricia's report on the grounds that it had been compiled during what he described as a period of marital deception. The argument was that I had engaged a financial investigator while still representing to my husband that our marriage was intact. My attorney's response was filed the next morning. It was 4 pages long and contained one argument that the motion did not have an answer for. My husband had been operating shell companies and transferring marital assets for 18 months before the filing. The investigation I had commissioned had begun after I discovered those activities. The timeline, documented and dated, made the sequence clear. I had not investigated a functioning marriage. I had investigated a financial concealment that was already underway. The motion was denied 2 days later. The rescheduled mediation proceeded as planned. Slow, even. My husband arrived differently the second time. His attorney arrived differently too. The negotiation that followed was not the one either of them had prepared for in the weeks before the filing. It was the one Patricia's report required. The settlement process took 11 weeks. That is not a short time, but it is considerably shorter than litigation would have taken, and litigation was the alternative my attorney outlined clearly when the initial counterproposal came back at a number that treated $2.3 million of documented assets as a rounding error. By the 4th week, the counterproposals had moved into a range that reflected the actual picture. By the 7th week, the property in Sycamore Ridge had been added to the marital asset pool. By the 11th week, a settlement figure had been reached that bore no resemblance to the one my husband had envisioned when he handed me that manila envelope on a Wednesday morning. His attorney shook my attorney's hand at the final session. My husband did not speak to me directly. He signed the documents, stood, and left the room without looking back, which was, in the end, a more honest exit than most of what had preceded it. The divorce was finalized on a Friday afternoon in early spring. My attorney called to tell me when the judge's signature came through, and her voice had the specific warmth of someone delivering news they had been working toward for a long time. I thanked her. I sat with it for a few minutes. Then I made myself a cup of tea, the same kind I had been drinking on the Monday evening when I closed Patricia's report for the first time, and I thought about the distance between those 2 moments. I kept my share of the business. That had been the thing I cared most about from the beginning. Not the accounts, not the property, not the settlement figure, but the 9 years of work I had put into something I had watched grow from a 2-person operation in a rented office into something real. My husband had tried to write me out of the origin of that thing. The settlement wrote me back in, with documentation. Patricia sent me a note after the case closed. Brief, professional, the kind of message she had probably sent 100 times. But one line stayed with me. She wrote that in 22 years of financial investigation, the cases that resolved most clearly were always the ones where someone had started paying attention before they had a reason to need to. I had started paying attention 14 months before I needed to. That margin had made every difference. I moved into a smaller place after the settlement closed, not because I had to, but because I wanted to start with something that was entirely mine, walls that held no version of the life I had been living inside without fully understanding what was happening underneath it. The new place had a kitchen window that looked out onto a courtyard with a single tree in it. I liked that it was one thing, clear and uncomplicated. I still have the notebook, the one with the grocery list handwriting and the $80 vendor name and the question mark. I kept it because it is the record of the moment I stopped scrolling past something that did not look right, a small decision that turned out to be the most important one I made in that entire period of my life. My husband, I was told by a mutual acquaintance some months later, had started a new business, smaller, solo, no partner. I wished him nothing specific in either direction. The part of my life that required wishing things about him was finished. The business I kept my share of has continued to grow. I am more involved now than I was in the final years of the marriage, when I had been quietly stepping back without fully understanding why. It turns out that stepping back in was simply a matter of removing the thing that had made stepping back feel easier. I think about the Tuesday evening with the notebook sometimes, the moment I wrote down a question mark instead of scrolling past. It did not feel significant at the time. It felt like the kind of small, careful habit my mother had always said was worth keeping, the habit of writing down the thing that does not add up and coming back to it later. I came back to it. What I found when I did changed everything that came after. On the first anniversary of the divorce finalization, I sat in my kitchen with the courtyard tree outside my window and thought about what it costs to build something quietly and what it means when someone decides, without asking, that your work was never part of the foundation. Then I opened my laptop and went back to the work, because that was always the point. Not the settlement, not the documentation, not the 214 pages. The work. The thing that had been mine before any of it, and was still mine after all of it. If someone is quietly moving things out of a life you built together, the question is never whether you can find it. The question is whether you started looking before they finished moving. If this reminded you of someone who paid attention before they had a reason to need to, you already know who needs to hear this. And if you have ever written down something that did not add up and wondered whether it mattered, stay close. There is another story coming tomorrow.